Sophomore year of college was supposed to be a fresh start for me, a new chapter where I could focus on my studies and make new friends. The dorms were filled with the usual chaos of students moving in, each of us assigned to a random roommate. Mine was a quiet guy, introverted but seemingly normal. At first I thought he might just be shy or socially awkward, so I tried to break the ice with casual conversations. I'd mention things I noticed he was interested in, but he'd only respond with one-word answers, making it clear he wasn't interested in talking. It wasn't long before I decided to back off and give him his space, figuring he just didn't like me. But then, things started to get weird. I began to notice that he was always watching me. It wasn't just a glance here and there, it felt constant. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but the more it happened, the more certain I became that it wasn't just my imagination. Whenever I was in the room, he'd be staring in my direction. If I turned to face him, he'd quickly avert his gaze, pretending to be focused on something else. But I could feel it, his eyes on me, watching. He'd lie on his bed, supposedly reading, but he held his book or papers in a way that gave him a direct line of sight to where I was sitting. As the days passed, I started spending more time out of the room, trying to avoid him. But whenever I came back, it was the same unsettling experience. Him just staring. It was creeping me out more and more. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that maybe he was just weird, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously off. About a week into the semester, my girlfriend and I decided to go on a morning hike. It was a perfect way to escape the tension in the dorm, if only for a little while. After the hike, we were exhausted, so we crashed on my bed around 2 p.m. We both fell asleep almost instantly. A couple of hours later, I woke up to an unsettling feeling. As I opened my eyes, I saw him standing there, just a few feet from my bed, staring at us. He didn't say a word, just stood there, motionless, his eyes fixed on us. It was like he was studying us, or worse, planning something. Without a word, he turned and left the room, but the damage was done. The sense of dread that had been slowly building up in me reached a peak. I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. I didn't waste any time. I packed up and moved out of that room as quickly as I could, convinced that if I stayed, I might not make it out alive. My mind kept conjuring up dark scenarios. What if he attacked me in my sleep? What if he was planning something even worse? The thought of waking up to find him standing over me was too much to bear. I wasn't about to stick around to find out if my fears were justified. After I moved out, I didn't see him for a long time, which was a relief. I started to feel like I could breathe again. But then, senior year rolled around, and I found out we were in the same class. I couldn't believe it when I saw him sitting a few rows behind me on the first day. The memories of that creepy dorm room experience came rushing back. I had been telling my friends about what had happened, but they didn't believe me, at least not until they saw it for themselves. One of my friends had really poor vision, so we always sat in the front row. I figured it would be a good opportunity to prove my point. I told them to just glance back every now and then, to see if my old roommate was staring at me like he used to. And sure enough, every single time I looked behind me, there he was, eyes locked on me. Not the professor, not anyone else, just me. It didn't matter where I sat in the classroom, he was always watching. It didn't take long for my friends to notice it too. Within 5 classes, they were as creeped out as I was, finally convinced that this guy was seriously disturbed. My parents had their own theory. They thought he might have been in love with me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his intentions were far more sinister. Even now, I'm convinced that if I had stayed in that dorm room, something terrible would have happened. I'll never know for sure what was going through his mind, but the fear he instilled in me was enough to keep me on edge for the rest of my time in college. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm alone. The idea that someone could be so fixated on me in such a dark and unsettling way is something that haunts me to this day. I'm just glad I got out when I did, because who knows what might have happened if I hadn't. Years ago, before my life revolved around kids, animals, a mortgage, and a husband, I was a travel writer exploring Europe. I often traveled alone, and this story is about the first time I visited a city that had always intrigued me: Prague. The trip was a spur-of-the-moment decision after my travel partner abruptly left me stranded in another country. With barely any time to prepare, I landed in Prague with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. My first stop was the accommodation office at the train station. I asked for a hostel close to the city center, embracing the thrill of spontaneity that I no longer indulge in these days. The hostel they directed me to was an old, dilapidated Art Deco building on a quiet, unremarkable street. It was about a 10-minute walk from the heart of the city. The building, once a symbol of grandeur, had long since succumbed to neglect. Its broken light fixtures and stained carpets contributed to its gloomy atmosphere. The air was thick with the smell of damp and dust, creating an unsettling ambiance. My room, a double for $12 per night, came with an unexpected roommate. Her belongings were scattered around: a suitcase, a dress draped over a plastic chair, makeup containers on a worn desk, and a stack of German fashion magazines on her bed. Despite her absence, I wasn't concerned. Backpackers are known for their unpredictability, and her absence was simply another part of the adventure. With no specific plans, I spent the afternoon exploring Old Town Square, the Jewish Quarter, and Wenceslas Square. I bought Czech crystal for my mother and some painted eggs from a street vendor for myself. The day was filled with the charm of Prague's historic streets and vibrant markets. As evening approached, I booked a sunset dinner cruise, eager to experience the city from the water. By 6 p.m., I returned to my room to freshen up, unload my purchases, and change clothes. To my surprise, there was still no sign of my roommate. I assumed she was out, perhaps on a short trip or socializing elsewhere. After the cruise, I stopped by a small bar on Tinska for a glass of wine. The city's Gothic architecture, coupled with the fog rolling off the Vltava River and the dimly lit cobblestone streets, created an atmosphere both thrilling and eerie. The night air was filled with an almost supernatural stillness, reminiscent of classic horror tales, but I felt no more danger than I would in any other large city. When I returned to the hostel around midnight, the silence was palpable. The common areas were empty, and there was an oppressive quietness that seemed to swallow the usual sounds of a bustling hostel. Still, there was no sign of my roommate. I entered the room and noticed something was off. Her bed was neatly made, the magazines were now on the nightstand, and her dress was missing. Most disconcerting was the pink silky nightgown laid out on my bed. I was puzzled by the nightgown's appearance. It didn't belong to me, and it seemed to have been placed there deliberately. I moved the nightgown to her bed and settled in for the night, writing in my journal. I assumed my roommate would return soon, as backpackers often come and go at odd hours. An hour later, with the room still empty, I needed to use the restroom. The hallway was eerily quiet, devoid of the usual sounds of hostel life. The few working lights flickered, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. I felt a growing unease as I walked back to my room, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. Upon reaching my room, I felt a wave of relief, only for it to dissipate quickly. The nightgown was back on my bed. A chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to keep the lamp on, but the shadows it cast only seemed to enhance the room's spooky atmosphere. I lay in bed, fully clothed, with the light blazing, my mind racing. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by the sound of the door creaking open. A figure stood in the doorway, illuminated by the faint light from the hallway. The man's face was contorted in distress, and he spoke in a broken voice, apologizing and pleading for help. Disoriented, I reached for the lamp switch, but when the room was fully lit, the doorway was empty. The door was locked from the inside, and the hallway outside was deserted. The rest of the night was spent sitting up in bed, fully clothed, with the lamp on. As dawn approached, I gathered my belongings and went to the reception desk to check out. I mentioned my concern about my missing roommate, describing the strange occurrences I had experienced. The young receptionist examined the room key and her computer, then looked at me with a mixture of confusion and concern. She revealed that the room had been empty for 3 weeks and had been cleaned since then. Only 6 guests were staying in the hostel at that time. The hostel has since been renovated into a luxury hotel. Though I never physically met anyone, it seems I encountered something, or someone, disturbing that night. The memories of that eerie evening remain vivid, a haunting reminder of an unsettling encounter in a city known for its dark and mysterious allure. I'm a 25-year-old non-binary person, living in a 4-bedroom house with my boyfriend and my best friend Tracy. We were on the hunt for a new roommate, and, in hindsight, I shouldn't have been the one in charge of finding one. I tend to overlook red flags, and this situation was a prime example. It all started with the house showing. The new guy, who introduced himself with a name that turned out to be fake, seemed odd from the start. He made a strange comment about not bringing meth into the house and how he hated drugs. I hadn't asked about drugs, so his comment threw me off. My boyfriend and the roommate who was moving out met him too, and while they agreed he seemed normal enough, I couldn't shake the weird vibe. He didn't fit the stereotype of someone on meth. He was chubby and his skin was clear. I figured maybe he was just nervous and trying to reassure us. My green hair and facial piercings might have made him think I was involved with drugs, but that wasn't the case. He came from a town known for its drug problems, and I thought he might be overly cautious about living with drug users. Despite my unease and Tracy's similar feelings, we were desperate for a roommate. Our other options were even sketchier, so we decided to let him move in. Move-in day was unsettling. He brought an old man to help with the move and then made him do all the heavy lifting, including a refrigerator, by himself. The new guy signed the lease and then revealed that the name he used earlier wasn't his real one. It seemed like he might have been hiding something, possibly to avoid a background check. I had to work that day, and Tracy kept messaging me about how weird he was, but her messages were vague. When I got home, she filled me in on the details. After signing the lease, the new guy went to a biker bar and got kicked out before 9 p.m., which was quite a feat, given how rowdy the place was. He came back drunk and said something about the men at the bar being intimidated by him. Tracy and I both guessed he might have been harassing people there. I had mentioned earlier that our landlord was coming the next day to fix some things. When Tracy reminded him, he had a meltdown, flailing his arms and making her uncomfortable to the point where she almost woke my boyfriend. He did calm down eventually, but the whole scene was alarming. Tracy had been sitting on a beanbag next to the couch when the new guy started reading his poetry to her. For an hour and a half, he read streams of consciousness about his disdain for drug users. Then he started complimenting her repeatedly and laid his head between her legs. When she tried to move away, he got closer and kept inviting her to his room for beer. After 2 hours of this harassment, Tracy finally retreated to her room. It got worse. Tracy's mom sent the new guy's picture to everyone she knew in his former town, and it turned out he had been stalking Tracy's aunt. He was banned from the bar where her aunt worked because of threats he'd made, and customers had to escort her to her car. We immediately informed our landlord. Fortunately, our lease wasn't finalized yet, and he agreed to evict the new guy. I called my mom for support, and Tracy called her brother to have backup in case things escalated. Our landlord arrived and told the new guy he had to leave. The new guy became aggressive, so we called the police. The officers told him he had no legal standing since there was no finalized lease. He had used a fake name and he hadn't been there for even a full day. He had to leave. He begged his sister to pick him up, and she only agreed after he offered her $200 for a short ride. He left behind most of his stuff on our porch. When we checked his room, it was a mess. Cigarette smoke, empty Dr. Pepper cans, and dirty socks everywhere. The stress of the situation was so overwhelming that I didn't notice he had left a pair of soiled shorts right in the main hallway, visible as soon as you walked into the house. They stayed there all day, even while the landlord was coming. I eventually picked them up with gloves and left them on the porch. but who knows if he'll ever come back for them. In the end, I'm relieved we caught this before the lease was finalized. This could have turned into a much worse situation for Tracy and me. I'm finally out of a truly dangerous situation with a roommate who could have turned my life upside down. I'm relieved that I moved out before anything worse could happen. When I first moved in, things seemed a bit off right from the start. My roommate Sarah was a 39-year-old who was divorced, unemployed, and living in student housing despite not being a student. Her behavior was strange from the beginning. She asked me to switch rooms, but she never showed up, so I ended up settling into the room I chose. We were sharing a small 2x2 apartment, which was already cramped. When Sarah finally showed up, she started complaining about everything. She argued that I should give up my room because it was larger and because she had a disability. She also demanded that I follow strict rules, like not wearing shoes inside and not bringing pork into the apartment, because she was Muslim. I agreed to these conditions, which seemed to surprise her. Maybe she expected me to argue or refuse, hoping it would force me to leave. The situation quickly spiraled. Sarah began acting in increasingly bizarre ways. She threatened to call the police if I had guests over, boasting about how she did this frequently at her previous places. Her rants were a mix of discriminatory comments and outright racist remarks against international students, refugees, and those protected by DACA. She claimed she had been wrongfully evicted from her last place, and that the staff had stolen her belongings. She obsessively cyberstalked the staff she blamed, collecting personal information like photos of their families and cars. She even stalked a student who had an injunction against her, repeatedly asking me how she could find him. Sarah's behavior didn't stop there. She would wash shoes and pillows at odd hours like 1 a.m., and whenever I had guests over, she would send me a barrage of messages threatening to make them leave. I documented all of this and had to go back and forth with management about her behavior. One night, I moved a washcloth from the oven handle while it was in use, thinking it might be a fire hazard. Sarah came banging on my door, furious that I had touched her property. She claimed I made a mess even though I hadn't. It was a completely irrational reaction. She also made a big deal about us using separate garbage bins, but as soon as I lined mine, she started using it herself. Her nightly routine was to disappear at exactly 10 p.m. and come back an hour later, extremely talkative and going on long rants. I tried to avoid her during these times, pretending to be asleep. The situation escalated when she asked if I knew who Jim Jones was. When I said no, she ominously replied that he had the right idea. It wasn't until later that I learned who Jim Jones was and felt a shiver of fear. I also discovered that Sarah had been tampering with my groceries, opening condiments and beverages. I had to throw everything out. Things reached a breaking point when I needed to use the common laundry facilities. Sarah had left clothes on the washer, so I moved them to the dryer to use the washer. She came in, furious, and accused me of touching her stuff. Despite explaining that I needed to use the washer, she yelled louder and threatened to call 911. When the police arrived, she made up a story that I had struck her. The police, after questioning her, realized that I hadn't hit her but that she was upset about my tone. Sarah continued to argue with the police, telling them to do their job and get rid of people like me. Sarah revealed more about herself through her nightly rants. She had been evicted 3 times, including from her own house after her divorce. She was being sued by her latest student housing company and had filed for bankruptcy. Despite all this, management didn't act to evict her, even though there was ample evidence of her threatening behavior and police reports. I'm incredibly relieved to have been moved to a new unit. The place is packed since school just started, and I can't believe I was lucky enough to escape Sarah's dangerous presence. It's beyond me why management didn't take more decisive action given everything I documented. When Max and I first moved into our apartment, we shared it with a couple who were great. Unfortunately, they decided to move to Pennsylvania because Florida wasn't their scene. So Max and I had to find new roommates to help with the rent since it was quite steep. The place was nice but a bit far from the city, which meant many of the people who showed interest in checking it out ended up backing out. After a while, we came across a young woman who seemed really laid back. She mentioned she was looking for a place for her boyfriend, Dan. My intuition usually gives me a strong feeling about people, and I didn't get a good vibe from Dan. I tried to push my feelings aside since everyone else seemed fine with him, hoping I was mistaken. Soon enough, Dan proved my instincts right. He was incredibly loud, threw parties on weeknights that lasted until 4 a.m., and played music so loudly it felt like it was blaring from our room. He was disrespectful, especially towards me, and Max didn't intervene, which I was partly relieved about since Dan's attitude suggested he might escalate things. We later discovered Dan had a history of shoplifting and other offenses, and he even threatened to get me hurt several times. One Wednesday evening, I returned home around 5:30 p.m. As I was heading up to our floor, I saw Dan leaving the apartment. I ignored him as usual, but he started shouting at me, insisting I should look inside the apartment. I peered in from the doorway and saw nothing out of place, so I asked what he was talking about. He claimed we had been robbed and that he had just returned to find the place in disarray. Despite his claims, the furniture seemed untouched. I noticed that my Wii U was missing, but all other consoles were still there. Suspicious of his behavior and trying to stay calm, I called Max to see when he'd be home since we usually arrived together. Dan kept yelling at me, saying he had already called the police and that I should do whatever I needed to do because the police were on their way. From his words, it was clear he had been home for a while, giving him time to hide anything incriminating. Within 5 minutes, the police arrived, followed by Max. One officer went upstairs with Dan and Max to take inventory of the missing items, while the other stayed downstairs with me. Max reported that a lot was missing from our room, but Dan claimed his PS4 was the only thing stolen. I asked the officer if it was possible to search Dan's car, and I offered for them to search our cars if needed. He agreed to check Dan's car, but didn't think it was necessary to search ours. Dan was asked to retrieve his ID and car keys from the apartment. We followed him upstairs and saw him get his wallet and keys before leaving. We decided to stay behind while the police searched his car. After a few minutes, Dan still hadn't returned, so we started looking around the neighborhood. By then, Dan had vanished. Fortunately, since Dan had consented to a car search and didn't revoke it, the officers unlocked his car, and we found all our missing items inside. One of our 2 3DS consoles, a PS4 controller, Max's laptop, and some Wii U games. The next morning, I placed all of Dan's belongings by the dumpster and had a locksmith change our locks. I considered getting a restraining order but ultimately decided against it. Weeks later, we spotted Dan's car parked near our building. We kept an eye on him from our window, ready to call 911 if needed. Thankfully, he left without incident, and we never saw him again. I still think about that summer every now and then, even though it happened years ago. It was right after I graduated high school and I was still living with my parents. One night, I was up late packing for a camping trip with friends. The heat was unbearable, so I had the window open while I folded clothes. It was about 2 in the morning when I saw a hand reaching through the open window. I screamed, and the hand quickly vanished. My first instinct was to think it might have been my younger brother playing a prank. I looked outside and saw a shadowy figure standing there, just watching me. I rushed to my brother's room where he was absorbed in a video game. We called the police, and they came to check things out. They searched the area but found nothing. They advised us to lock our windows and doors and left. We were all rattled, but my mom had a gut feeling that the intruder would return. Her intuition proved right. She went outside to the back porch and kept watch. After about 20 minutes, she spotted a man dressed in black sneaking into our backyard. He moved stealthily from tree to tree, making his way closer to my window. When my mom shouted at him, he fled. The police came back, but once again he was gone without a trace. I never opened that window again. My parents installed motion-activated lights, and it seemed like the ordeal was over. About 6 months later, my friend and I moved into a downtown apartment. It was our first place on our own, and despite the poor quality of the apartment, we were excited to be living in the city. The only downside was the street parking. A few weeks after moving in, my car was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but there was a single rose left on the passenger seat. It was unsettling, but I made a point to stay vigilant. I tried to park close to the entrance and under the streetlights, but sometimes I had to park on darker streets. The break-ins continued, usually with flowers left behind. Occasionally, there was something more disturbing, like a pair of men's underwear, or even creepier, a bag of Tootsie Rolls, my favorite candy. It felt like the person knew me personally, and I became increasingly suspicious of everyone around me. One day, while doing laundry in the building's basement, I discovered that all my undergarments had been stolen. Shortly after, a friend's tires were slashed during a visit. By the time I received the first letter, I was already planning to move. The letter spoke of a love that had been developing for years and included details that made it clear the writer had been watching me closely. I managed to find someone to take over my lease and moved in with another friend on the other side of the city. The new place was secure, with an underground parking garage only accessible to tenants. For a while, things were calm. Then my roommate started dating someone new. Ashley's new boyfriend, Matt, seemed off from the start. They had met on MySpace, and he was strikingly handsome, which seemed odd given Ashley's usual partners. Matt was quiet and always wore an unsettling smile. Conversations with him were awkward because he would bring up random facts unrelated to what we were discussing. I had deleted my MySpace account after the stalking began, but I created a fake one to investigate Matt. His profile was vague, with mostly pictures of himself and little information about his friends or life. I tried to warn Ashley about Matt, but she was defensive and shut down any concerns. Matt spent more time at our apartment, and I started avoiding home as much as possible. One day I returned to find Matt on my couch, alone, drinking a beer. Ashley was at work and he had been told he could hang out. I was frustrated, but decided to ignore him and went to my room, shutting the door behind me. A little while later, Matt knocked on my door and suggested we watch TV together since we both cared about Ashley. Reluctantly, I agreed. During the movie, I noticed Matt staring at me with an unnerving smile. When I asked what he was staring at, he simply said he couldn't believe it and then went back to watching the film. I locked my door afterward, feeling uneasy. As time went on, Matt practically moved in, bringing his belongings into Ashley's room. I was dreading the thought of moving again, but started looking for options. On their 6-month anniversary, I saw a bouquet of flowers and an open card on the table. Curiosity got the better of me, and I read the card. The handwriting was identical to that of the letters from my previous stalker. I compared it with the old letters I had kept for evidence. It was the same. I immediately called the police and then reached out to Ashley asking her to come over. She was at work but promised to come as soon as she could. I was terrified of telling her, knowing how devastated she would be. The police took my statement and went to Ashley's workplace to get more information from her. They ended up breaking the news to her, and she called Matt, leaving an angry message despite the police's advice not to contact him. He disappeared right after that. The police couldn't find Matt or anyone matching his description at the place he claimed to work. Ashley had never been to his apartment, and his stories about staying with friends and not seeing his family were all lies. It turned out Ashley had been dating a stranger, and we never knew if Matt was even his real name. The final twist came when Ashley and I went through Matt's belongings, which he left behind. We found a duffel bag filled with gym clothes and, in one compartment, about 10 pictures of me. Most were taken from afar, but one showed me sleeping. The sheets were from our current apartment, confirming that it was taken after I started locking my door. Some pictures dated back to before the incident at my parents' house, linking him to both events. We also found 2 pairs of my missing underwear, a Starbucks lid with my lipstick marks, and a necklace I hadn't noticed was gone, among other disturbing items. Despite our efforts, the police never managed to track him down. I took an opportunity to move overseas, leaving everything behind. Ashley and I drifted apart. She struggled with the reality that her first love was a psychotic stalker. I harbored some anger, feeling misled by Matt's lies and the trouble he caused. Living with the knowledge of being stalked changes you. Even after moving across the world, I constantly looked over my shoulder. I have no social media accounts under my real name, and am now married with children. I often worry that Matt may resurface, but I try to stay cautious whenever I visit my hometown. Part of me will always be on edge, wondering if he'll ever come back.